You're at a weekend barbecue or maybe a family dinner. The sun is setting, the ambient noise is pleasant, people are laughing.
Right, a totally normal evening.
Yeah, exactly. Someone hands you a cold drink, smiles warmly, and asks the inevitable question. They say, "So what do you do?"
Oh, the classic conversation starter.
Right. And you give them your job title because, well, I mean, it's the easiest shorthand. It communicates your status, your general salary bracket, your daily routine.
It's an efficient answer that just keeps the conversation moving.
It is. But as the words leave your mouth, something feels entirely wrong.
Like it doesn't belong to you.
Yes, the title feels like this heavy borrowed coat. Because on paper, you're a high achiever. You have the credentials, the track record. You did everything you were supposed to do.
You followed the script perfectly.
Right. But internally, beneath that very casual barbecue conversation, there is a quiet, persistent dread.
It's a profound, almost invisible dissonance. You are standing there, holding your drink, watching yourself play a character.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
You hear your own voice reciting the script of your professional life, and yet a part of you is observing this performance from a distance, just feeling completely detached from the words.
I think it's so important to name what this actually is because we usually misdiagnose this. We think, oh, I'm just working too many hours.
Right, or I just need a 2-week vacation to recharge.
Exactly. But it's not burnout in the traditional sense of like physical exhaustion. It's the friction of playing a part that doesn't fit for 40, 50, 60 hours a week.
Which is incredibly draining.
It really is. It's that sudden, terrifying realization that if this title, this noun you just handed to a stranger, is the only thing propping up your sense of self, you are standing on incredibly shaky ground.
And that's a terrifying place to be.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to understand the architecture of this modern identity crisis.
We're going to look at the sociological and psychological research behind what happens when our careers no longer match our internal reality.
Right, and how we actually navigate the messy, unscripted wilderness of changing who we are.
Because that moment at the barbecue, that microsecond of hesitation before you answer the question, that feeling of being a stranger to your own professional mask, it's actually incredibly significant.
It feels like a failure, though.
It does, but it is not a sign of weakness. It is the quiet beginning of a profound human shift. It is the moment the old identity starts to crack, not because you have failed, but because you are outgrowing the container you were placed in.
I think we need to look deeply at why that container feels so rigid in the first place. I mean, we walk around carrying the weight of a title.
We really do.
We fuse our entire identity with a specific organizational role. You are the manager. You are the litigator.
Or the consultant, yeah.
Right. And we do this voluntarily, but we also do it because society aggressively rewards it. The modern workplace demands what we might call an ideal professional mask.
Absolutely. You aren't just paid to perform tasks anymore.
No, you are expected to embody the role entirely. You are supposed to be assertive, always on, hyperproductive, and entirely synonymous with your output.
And the fusion you're talking about is deeply psychological. It has roots in how our society structures human value.
How so?
Well, when we look at occupational sociology, there's a foundational concept known as a master status.
A master status.
Yeah. Historically, your occupation hasn't just been a thing you do to earn currency. It has functioned as your master status.
Yeah.
It is the primary lens through which society views you, categorizes you, and assigns you worth.
So it's how everyone else makes sense of you.
Exactly. And consequently, it becomes the primary lens through which you view yourself. When you spend 10 or 20 years polishing this mask to fit the exact specifications of a successful professional in your field, you inevitably begin to lose the boundary between the person and the performance.
Which brings a massive biological and cognitive cost, right? I mean, maintaining a performative identity is
It
exhausting.
takes so much energy.
I've heard it described almost like running a computer system. Think about running a software emulator on a computer.
Okay, like this analogy.
Let's say you have a Mac, but for your job, you absolutely have to run a very specific, clunky old Windows program. So you download an emulator.
Right, to fake the environment.
Exactly. It creates a fake environment inside your computer. Now, technically, it works. You can do the job. But listen to your computer. The fans are screaming.
The battery is draining.
The battery drains in half the normal time. The entire machine runs hot. Every other process slows to an absolute crawl because the system is using massive amounts of background processing power just to keep that fake environment from crashing.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize what psychologists call emotive dissonance.
Emotive dissonance.
Yeah, emotive dissonance is the severe gap between what you genuinely feel and the emotions or persona you are organizationally required to display. It is the cognitive emulator running in the background of your life.
So it's literally exhausting your brain.
Completely. When you are a naturally empathetic, consensus-building person, forced to play the role of a ruthless, cost-cutting executive, or conversely, a naturally independent thinker forced to play the role of a deeply compliant team player, you are running an emulator.
And just like the computer, your biological battery drains rapidly.
Right. You go home completely depleted, not from the physical labor of the day, but from the immense cognitive load required to maintain the fiction.
If you value conversations like this, you can stay with us here.
And that exhaustion is what usually precipitates the classic mid-career crisis. You wake up on a random Tuesday, look in the mirror, and wonder whose life you are actually living.
Because the daily actions simply do not match the internal values anymore. But what makes this so incredibly paralyzing is the relational angle.
The way it affects our relationships.
Yeah, if your entire identity is fused with this role, any external change, a company restructure, a shift in the market, a sudden layoff, doesn't just feel like a career setback.
It feels like an existential threat.
Exactly. It feels like personal erasure.
It is an erasure in a social sense. If your master status is the marketing director, and suddenly that role is eliminated by a corporate merger, the loss is not merely financial.
I mean, the financial loss is terrifying, obviously.
Of course, but the deeper terror is the loss of self-definition. Without the title, who are you to your friends? Who are you to your family?
Right. Who are you to your peers who are still safely inside their own professional masks?
We become terrified of losing our status or even voluntarily stepping away from it because we haven't cultivated an identity outside of the institutional scaffolding. If you take away the scaffold, we feel like we will simply collapse into nothingness.
So we have this feeling, this dread, this cognitive emulator running our batteries down, this terror that without the noun, we are no one.
Yeah.
We are standing at the barbecue realizing the coat doesn't fit. What do we do with it? What is actually happening to us scientifically and psychologically when we hit this wall and the identity begins to fracture?
Well, we are entering a psychological and anthropological state known as liminality.
Liminality. I hear this word thrown around a lot lately, mostly in art or architecture, referring to like empty hallways or deserted airports.
Right. The internet loves liminal spaces.
Yeah, but what does it mean for a human life?
The term comes from the Latin word limen, which literally translates to threshold. Think of it as the physical space in a doorway.
Okay.
When you are standing exactly on the threshold, you are no longer in the room you just left, but you have not yet entered the room ahead of you. You are in between.
Betwixt and between.
Exactly. The concept was originated in the early 20th century by the anthropologist Arnold van Gennep and later expanded upon by Victor Turner to describe human rites of passage.
Rites of passage, like tribal rituals.
Yes. In ancient societies, liminality was clearly defined. When a child was becoming an adult, they were physically separated from the tribe, stripped of their childhood name, and sent into the wilderness. During that time, they were nobody. They were betwixt and between. They were in liminality. Only after completing the rite were they assimilated back into the community with a new name and a new status.
But I want to push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
Because translating ancient tribal rituals to modern corporate life can sometimes feel, I don't know, a bit romanticized.
Yeah, I can see that.
When someone is unhappy in their job or they get laid off and don't know what to do next, they often say, oh, I'm in a liminal space.
Yeah.
Is liminality sometimes just a fancy, comforting academic word for being indecisive?
Or just being stuck in a rut.
Yeah, because you're too afraid to make a choice. It can sound a lot like an excuse for just not knowing what to do and refusing to commit.
That is the most common critique, and it's a vital one to address. But the research is firm here. True liminality is not simply indecision or laziness.
It's not.
No, it is a necessary structural phase of transformation. It is not optional. In Van Gennep's framework, any authentic human transition requires 3 distinct stages: separation, the liminal state, and assimilation.
So you literally can't skip the middle.
You cannot skip the middle. You cannot simply take off one complex identity and instantly zip up another one without an intervening period of formlessness.
That makes sense.
Liminality is a bounded period of time where the normal rules of everyday life and the normal rules of your own ego are suspended. It's a psychological space that allows you to survive the radical, disorienting shift from one mode of existence to another.
So it's not a failure to decide.
No, it is the fertile void where the old identity dissolves completely so that a new one actually has the space to form.
Okay, but let's advocate for the person listening to this right now who is thinking, a fertile void sounds beautiful if you have a massive savings account or a trust fund.
Right, the economic reality.
Yeah, if I have a mortgage, 3 kids, and a car payment, spending time in a fertile void sounds like a luxury I absolutely cannot afford. How does the research reconcile this deep psychological need for a liminal space with the brutal reality that we have to pay our bills?
That tension is exactly why modern transitions are so uniquely painful. We don't have a designated wilderness to retreat to while the village feeds us.
We really don't.
So the research makes a crucial distinction here regarding what liminality looks like in the modern world. It is rarely a complete cessation of work.
So you don't just quit everything.
Usually not. It manifests as cognitive and emotional liminality while you maintain some form of baseline survival. You might take a bridge job, a role that pays the bills but requires zero emotional investment.
Or you might just stay in your current job, but psychologically detach from it.
Exactly. Withdrawing your ego from the outcome while you explore other avenues on nights and weekends. Liminality doesn't mean you stop earning money. It means you detach your identity from the way you earn money for a temporary period.
So what does this mean in the context of what the research calls macro work role transitions?
Well, a macro work role transition is a fundamental, non-institutionalized shift. We aren't talking about getting a promotion from senior analyst to vice president within the same bank.
Because that's mapped out for you.
Right, that is a micro transition. The institution hands you a script for that. A macro transition is the banker who decides to become a candle maker.
Or the ruthless corporate litigator who leaves the law entirely to run a local nonprofit focusing on food scarcity.
Yes, or the logistics manager who opens an independent bookstore. These transitions are terrifying precisely because they lack clear steps. There is no HR department managing your pivot.
No peers doing it alongside you in a designated cohort.
And there's certainly no gatekeepers handing you a gold watch to mark your progress. You are stepping completely off the scripted path and into the wilderness.
And that wilderness is exactly what liminality feels like. You are untethered. You don't have the new noun yet.
Right.
But how do we actually navigate that wilderness without losing our minds? If we don't have the script and we don't have the HR department telling us what our goals are for Q3, how do we systematically build the new identity?
This is where the science gets truly fascinating and deeply counterintuitive. To understand how we build a new identity, we have to look at the groundbreaking work of Herminia Ibarra.
She's an organizational behavior researcher, right?
Yes, she deeply studies career reinvention. She introduces the psychology of possible selves.
Possible selves. I love the framing of that. It implies multiple valid outcomes rather than just one destined path.
Exactly. Possible selves refers to the vivid, concrete images we hold in our minds about who we might become, who we would deeply like to become, and conversely, who we are terrified of becoming.
So we all have these versions of ourselves floating around.
We all carry a portfolio of these possible selves. The critical paradigm-shifting insight from Ibarra's research is this. We do not just think our way into a new identity. We act our way into it.
Wait, let's pause right there. We don't think our way into it.
No.
Because the standard, universally accepted advice for mid-career crisis is always take a step back, take a sabbatical, do some deep soul searching, write in a journal, figure out your ultimate passion, make a detailed 5-year plan, and then execute that plan flawlessly.
And that standard advice is exactly why millions of people get paralyzed in a state of perpetual anxiety.
Right.
Yes. You cannot reflect your way out of an identity crisis because profound self-knowledge cannot be obtained purely through introspection. The human brain doesn't work that way.
Identity isn't a buried treasure that you discover by thinking hard enough.
Exactly. Identity has to be inferred from behavior. We infer who we are and what we actually value by observing ourselves in the act of doing things in the real world.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, the introspection model is flawed because we're trying to evaluate a possible self that we have no real-world data on.
Right.
We have to actually observe ourselves doing the thing to know if we want to be the person who does the thing.
Precisely. You cannot know if you want to be a farmer until you feel the dirt under your fingernails at 5 a.m. in the freezing rain.
Right. Sitting in a coffee shop journaling about farming isn't the same thing.
Introspection only gives you a fantasy of the identity. Action gives you the reality. Ibarra identifies 3 highly specific mechanisms that people successfully use to elaborate and test these new possible selves during a liminal period.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first mechanism is work activities.
Meaning taking on new tasks, like side projects.
Side projects, evening classes, ephemeral roles, volunteering, pro bono consulting on the weekends. The key is that you are testing unfamiliar waters as a peripheral entrant.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say your possible self is a documentary filmmaker, but your current reality is a corporate supply chain manager. You do not just dramatically quit your corporate job, declare yourself a director, and drain your savings to make a feature film.
That sounds like a disaster.
It is a recipe for disaster. Instead, you utilize the first mechanism. You take a weekend editing course. You volunteer to shoot a 3-minute promotional video for a local dog shelter.
And in doing that, you are generating data.
Exactly. You are observing yourself in the act of filmmaking. Does the meticulous, tedious process of video editing give you energy, or does it completely drain you?
Do you actually enjoy interviewing subjects, or do you find it terrifying?
By trying out new possibilities on a limited but incredibly tangible scale, you accumulate real lived experience. And simultaneously, this is crucial, you begin to diminish your psychological commitment to your old identity.
So it's a gradual thing.
It's a gradual, organic process of mutual withdrawal from the old world. You don't have to blow up your life. You just start slowly shifting your energy allocations.
This makes so much sense. It removes the massive pressure of having to know everything in advance. You're just running small, low-risk experiments.
Exactly.
So that is mechanism 1, work activities. What is the second mechanism?
The second mechanism is relationships and networks. This is rooted in the sociological reality that identity is entirely socially constructed. We cannot be something in a vacuum. We need an audience to confirm our identity.
Yeah.
During a transition, we desperately need to find guiding figures. Interestingly, the research shows these figures are almost never our closest friends or immediate family.
Really?
They are what sociologists call weak ties.
Weak ties.
Acquaintances, people outside our normal circles, colleagues of colleagues, who somehow embody the new possibilities we are considering.
Why weak ties? That seems backwards. If I am going through a massive life transition, why wouldn't I lean on my spouse, my parents, or my absolute best friends? They know me better than anyone.
Because they know your current identity better than anyone, and they are heavily, emotionally invested in that current identity remaining stable.
Oh, wow.
Let's look at the human dynamic here. Imagine you go to your spouse or your lifelong best friend and you announce, I am incredibly unfulfilled. I am leaving my lucrative, stable law practice to start a highly speculative landscape design business.
Their nervous systems would instantly flood with panic.
Yes, their reaction is almost guaranteed to be fear, skepticism, or an attempt to pigeonhole you back into the role they understand. And it's not because they are unsupportive people.
Right, if they love you.
Exactly. But it is because human beings are deeply tribal. They are trying to protect you from financial ruin, but subconsciously, they are also protecting their own understanding of the world.
Your sudden shift threatens their own narrative.
It alters the dynamic of the relationship. They might think, well, if you're no longer the high-powered lawyer who pays for our vacations, who are you? And who am I in relation to you?
The people closest to us hold up a mirror, but the mirror only reflects the old version of us.
That is beautifully put, yes. Weak ties. The guy you met at a coffee shop who runs a local nursery or the instructor of your evening horticulture class, they do not have that historical baggage.
They don't know the lawyer.
When you tell them your idea, they don't see the lawyer, they just see a budding landscape designer. They can freely condone and validate your new direction. They provide the psychological safety and the concrete role modeling necessary to start making the shift.
They treat you as the new identity before you even fully believe it yourself.
Exactly.
We need a new audience to reflect the new self back to us, so we can finally see it as real. That is incredibly profound. Okay, so we have work activities to generate data, and weak ties to provide a new mirror. What is the third mechanism Ibarra identifies?
The third mechanism is life events. Psychologists often refer to these as the jolts.
The jolts. What constitutes a jolt?
A jolt is anything that ruptures your routine and forces a confrontation with your reality. These can be massive, undeniable macro events.
Like getting fired?
A sudden company-wide layoff, a global pandemic that changes how the world works, a serious health diagnosis, or the death of a parent. But they can also be surprisingly micro, seemingly mundane realizations. It could be receiving a lackluster performance review and realizing you simply don't care enough to improve. It could be waking up one Tuesday, staring at your inbox, and realizing with crystal clarity that you physically cannot send one more meaningless email about synergizing deliverables.
It's the moment the emulator finally crashes. The cognitive load becomes too much to bear.
Yes, the jolts force the issue. They take all the simmering subconscious doubts that you've been repressing for years and thrust them into your conscious mind.
But they make the pain accessible.
And undeniable. But more importantly, from a psychological standpoint, jolts create a profound narrative rupture that demands a response.
What do you mean by a narrative rupture?
Human beings operate on continuous storylines. When a jolt happens, the story breaks. You are suddenly forced to explain to yourself and to the people around you why this event matters and what you are going to do about it.
If you get laid off, you can't just ignore it.
No, you have to actively construct a story about what the layoff means. Was it a tragedy, or was it the push you needed? The jolt acts as the catalyst that accelerates the transition out of the liminal space and forces you to begin weaving the new possible self into reality.
So we have this framework of possible selves, mechanisms, and jolts. But I want to zoom out for a second and ask what this all means for how we view careers today on a macro level.
It's a huge shift.
Because this entire conversation about liminality and shifting identities sounds very, very different from how our parents or grandparents navigated the working world. For them, it seemed like you picked a noun at age 22 and you stayed that noun until you retired at 65.
It is entirely different, and acknowledging that difference is key to understanding why our generation feels so much anxiety. We have experienced a massive structural shift in career sociology.
Right.
We have fully moved away from the era of the linear career. The linear career was the predictable upward climb within one or two monolithic organizations over a lifetime.
You started in the mailroom, you moved to sales, you became a manager, you retired with a pension.
The institution dictated your path. Today, organizational researchers categorize the modern reality under two dominant frameworks: the protean career and the boundaryless career.
Let's define those. Protean.
Yeah.
That relates to the Greek sea god Proteus, right? The one who could change his shape at will to avoid capture.
That's the one. A protean career attitude is driven entirely by the individual, not the organization. In a protean framework, the core values are psychological freedom and continuous growth.
So it's very internal.
Completely. The criteria for success are subjective. It is no longer about objectively moving up a corporate ladder to attain a higher salary. It is about finding personal alignment, self-fulfillment, and adapting your shape to fit your evolving internal values.
And what about the boundaryless career?
A boundaryless career is characterized by high, almost constant mobility. It's a structural preference for navigating different physical and psychological work landscapes.
So you aren't stuck in one building.
You are not bound by the four walls of a single corporation. You might work across 3 different industries in a decade. You might move fluidly between full-time W-2 employment, independent contracting, and starting your own small business. You collaborate with vast, decentralized networks outside a single firm.
So we have this massive societal shift to protean and boundaryless careers. On paper, it sounds incredibly liberating. We are free. We can shapeshift. We can cross boundaries.
That's great.
Why is it causing so much deep existential dread?
Because with extreme freedom comes the complete loss of institutional scaffolding. Our modern transitions are what sociologists term under-institutionalized.
Under-institutionalized.
Think about the linear career again. In that model, the institution was your scaffold. It told you who you were, when you were allowed to get promoted, what your exact title was, what your daily duties were, and precisely what success looked like.
Your identity was handed to you, prepackaged.
When you remove that scaffolding to embrace a boundaryless career, you are now solely, terrifyingly responsible for constructing your own professional identity from scratch.
You have to invent the metrics for your own success.
And as we just discussed, building an identity from scratch in the liminal wilderness requires a massive amount of emotional and cognitive labor.
Which brings us perfectly to how this abstract sociological theory manifests in the real, grinding reality of the modern world. Let's look at the absolute extreme end of this boundaryless landscape.
The gig economy.
Exactly. You've got Uber drivers, freelance graphic designers, TaskRabbit workers, independent copywriters. This entire sector of the economy is constantly sold to us as the ultimate manifestation of freedom.
Right. The marketing slogans are everywhere. Be your own boss. Set your own hours. Work from anywhere.
But the sociological research we're looking at shows it's actually creating a massive, widespread identity crisis. I'm struggling to see how having the ultimate freedom to dictate your own day leads to a crisis of self.
Well, if we connect this back to the fundamental ways human identity is formed, the crisis becomes completely understandable. Freedom from a boss is wonderful, but also means freedom from the organizational context that tells us who we are.
Right.
Sociologists who study precarious labor use a very specific term for this: identity precarity.
Identity precarity. Explain what that means on a Tuesday morning for a gig worker.
Let's compare it to traditional work. In a traditional job, you have two vital anchors for your identity: spatial continuity and temporal continuity.
Okay, spatial continuity meeting.
Spatial continuity means you go to the same building or log into the same team server, you see the same colleagues, you belong to a specific place.
And temporal continuity.
That means you have a sense of career progression over time. You start a project in January, you struggle through it in March, and you launch it in June. You have a narrative arc.
So what happens in gig work?
In gig work, both anchors are severed. The tasks are hyper-fragmented. An Uber ride is a closed loop of 20 minutes. A freelance graphic design gig is a closed loop of 3 days.
Oh, I see.
This temporal discontinuity completely disrupts the biographical continuity that we rely on to anchor our occupational identity.
You're just executing an endless series of disconnected tasks rather than building a cohesive career narrative.
Exactly. There was a fascinating sociological study interviewing gig workers, and one worker put it perfectly, summarizing the entire crisis in one sentence.
What did they say?
They said, "One day I'm delivering food across the city, the next day I'm moving furniture for startup, the next day I'm doing data entry. I'm good at all of it, but I'm not really anything specific."
Wow.
That is the haunting voice of identity precarity. You are a highly functional ghost in the economy.
So how do human beings survive that? We just established that the brain needs an identity to function. How do gig workers cope with being ghosts?
To cope with this void, gig workers are forced to engage in intense, continuous identity work. The research identifies several coping mechanisms, the most prominent being entrepreneurial framing.
What does that look like in practice?
It involves a deliberate cognitive shift. Instead of viewing themselves as disposable, precarious laborers who are at the mercy of an algorithm, which is often the harsh economic reality, they actively reframe their narratives.
They tell themselves a different story.
Yes. They convince themselves and tell others that they are independent business owners, they are entrepreneurs building an empire.
Why does that trick the brain?
Because entrepreneur is a highly respected, culturally canonical script. It implies agency, control, and future wealth. By adopting this frame, they mitigate the anxiety of precarity.
That makes sense.
Another mechanism is focusing on building a portfolio. Instead of having one job, they tell themselves they are curating a diverse portfolio of skills. They have to constantly hustle, not just for the next $50 paycheck, but for the psychological validation of their own existence.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. You aren't just doing the labor. You're acting as your own HR department, your own marketing team, and your own internal therapist, desperately trying to hold your identity together with tape and string.
There are more people thinking about this than you might expect.
Let's bring this down from the macro economy to some highly specific, deeply relatable case studies of people navigating this messy middle. People who are in the liminal space, perhaps outside the pure gig economy, but very much in the throes of transition.
The research highlights two distinct patterns of behavior during a pivot. Let's start with the first example, Thomas, the finance guy.
Right.
Thomas is a textbook example of what organizational researchers call the exploit and explore pattern. Let's look at his trajectory.
Okay.
Thomas had a very conventional, highly successful, linear career in corporate finance at a Fortune 500 company. He did everything right. He climbed the ladder diligently until he was 48 years old, reached a senior director level, made excellent money, and then a massive jolt.
He got laid off.
Due to a sudden corporate merger, his entire business unit was dismantled and he was laid off.
The ultimate, devastating, forced separation from his master status. One day he is the director. The next day he is a guy with a cardboard box standing in the parking lot.
Yes, and because of his age, his seniority, and his highly specific, specialized skill set, the transition was incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
He couldn't just slide into a lateral role at a competing firm.
They thought he was too expensive or overqualified.
Exactly. The industry gatekeepers looked at his resume and said he was overqualified, too specialized, or simply too expensive. The institutional doors were locked, so he enters liminality.
And what does he do?
He utilized the exploit and explore strategy. First, the exploit phase. He swallowed his pride and took a temporary lower-level consulting gig at a mid-sized firm simply to avoid a terrifying resume gap and keep cash flowing.
So he was exploiting his existing skills for immediate baseline survival.
Right. But the key is that he didn't stop there. He didn't just accept the lesser known.
What was the explore phase?
While he was exploiting his old skills during the day, his nights and weekends were dedicated to the explore phase. He reached out to weak ties. He reconnected with old friends who were in similar, untethered situations.
And they started doing stuff together.
They started sharing a cheap office space. He began collaborating on various tech startup ideas. He tested possible selves as a tech entrepreneur. And here's the crucial detail. None of those startups really took off. They failed.
Which, in the standard cultural narrative we all subscribe to, sounds like a tragic failure, right? If you leave finance to start a tech company and the tech company fails, society views you as having failed the transition. You're a cautionary tale.
But the science of transitions views this entirely differently. In the liminal phase, failure is not a tragedy. Failure is just data.
It's just data.
It is information telling you which possible self is unviable. While Thomas was busy failing at tech startups, he was actively out in the world generating interactions. During this period, he casually noticed a massive underserved gap in the market regarding the operational management of assisted living facilities.
Just by being out there.
Right. He started having coffee with people in that sector. He utilized his finance background to start structuring small deals for them. And gradually, over years of hustling, failing, and adapting, he evolved into a highly sought-after operational expert in the assisted living niche.
He didn't plan that from the start.
He did not start with a grand 10-year plan to enter the assisted living market. He couldn't have. He didn't even know the market existed when he was laid off. He generated data, he iterated, and he acted his way into it.
He explored and exploited simultaneously until a new path emerged from the fog. It's messy, but it works. Let's look at the second case study, which presents a very different approach. Sophie, the lawyer. Her behavioral pattern is defined as diverge and delay.
Right. Sophie's situation was different from Thomas's because her transition was voluntary, which brings its own unique set of psychological challenges.
She wasn't laid off.
No, Sophie was deeply burned out, experiencing severe emotive dissonance, coming out of a grueling 2-decade career in corporate law. She had reached the absolute limit of her cognitive emulator, so she quit.
Is up and quit.
But instead of immediately panicking and grabbing the nearest familiar branch, which is the instinctual reaction for most high achievers when they enter the terror of liminality, she exhibited incredible restraint. She intentionally delayed committing to a new path. She allowed her identity to wildly diverge.
She gave herself permission to scatter. I mean, looking at her activities, she was all over the map.
She really was.
She got herself accredited as a corporate board director. She took evening journalism classes. She enrolled in documentary filmmaking courses. She did a little freelance compliance consulting on the side. She joined the board of local nonprofit. She was practically vibrating with different directions.
To the outside world, to her former law partners, she looked lost, scattered, and deeply unfocused. But sociologically, she was doing something incredibly strategic. She was creating a secure environment to test risky, conflicting identities.
Like test labs.
Yes. She was using these diverse extracurricular activities as social cocoons. A cocoon is a safe, bounded space where you can be a beginner without professional consequences. By dabbling in so many different areas, she intentionally delayed premature closure.
Premature closure.
Premature closure is the trap of grabbing a new identity just to relieve the anxiety of not having one, only to find out 3 years later that you hate the new identity just as much as the old one.
By taking the time, she gathered the data.
Exactly. By the time her financial cushion finally started to thin, forcing her to make a decision, she wasn't guessing anymore. She had actual lived emotional data on what activities gave her energy and what drained her.
So what did she choose?
Through the process of divergence, she realized a fundamental truth about herself. She didn't want one master status anymore. She realized she preferred a boundaryless portfolio of diverse work, a mix of board consulting, writing, and legal advisory, over committing entirely to the single all-consuming identity of documentary filmmaker. She learned her own shape.
And both of these stories highlight something we desperately need to address, which is the immense shame associated with this messy middle period.
The shame is huge.
Because when you are Thomas, testing failed startups in a rented office, or Sophie, sitting in a beginner's filmmaking class alongside 22-year-olds after spending 20 years as a terrifyingly competent corporate lawyer, society looks at you sideways.
People pity you.
They whisper about you at barbecues. We have this pervasive toxic cultural myth that I like to call the hero's pivot.
Ah, the hero's pivot.
Yeah.
It is perhaps the most damaging narrative in modern career development.
We believe that a career transition is supposed to look like a movie. You're supposed to have a sudden, brilliant epiphany on a mountaintop or during a yoga retreat.
You draft a flawless master plan on a napkin.
You boldly quit your job, you execute the plan perfectly, and 6 months later, you are on the cover of a magazine. And because we believe this myth, if we find ourselves confused, if we are dabbling, if we are failing at small experiments, we internalize that friction as a personal failure. We think, I must be doing this wrong because it feels terrible.
We have to completely and aggressively dismantle the myth of the hero's pivot. It is a fiction manufactured by hindsight and marketing. The reality of any genuine transition is what researchers suggest we reframe as the learning plot.
The learning plot, how does that change the perspective?
Well, in a cinematic hero's journey, the hero already knows their destiny and just has to overcome external obstacles to get there. In a learning plot, the protagonist does not know who they are or where they are going. The story is driven by internal confusion, ongoing struggle, adaptation, and iterative, messy experiments. The obstacles aren't external enemies. The obstacles are their own outdated assumptions.
So it's supposed to be messy.
Being in liminality is not a failure. It is an essential identity timeout. You are allowed to get lost. In fact, getting lost, trying things that do not work, and feeling deeply uncomfortable is the absolute prerequisite for being found.
I want to pivot here and highlight something really practical for the listener. We've established that the master status is fragile. The noun can be taken away from you.
Very easily, yes.
So how do we build a career identity that doesn't completely shatter into a million pieces the next time the market shifts, or AI automates our industry, or we simply wake up and realize we're unhappy? How do we build an identity with deep structural resilience?
But the research points to a very specific, profound cognitive shift. We must move our self-definition from nouns to verbs.
Okay, nouns to verb.
This is perhaps the most crucial survival concept for the modern boundaryless era. As long as you anchor your identity to a noun, I am a marketing manager, I am a journalist, I am an architect, you are incredibly vulnerable.
Because the noun is tied to the job.
Nouns are inherently fragile because they are granted by institutions. If the institution disappears, if the industry collapses, the noun disappears and your identity vanishes with it. To build a resilient career identity, you must fundamentally separate what you do from who you are. You need to anchor your sense of self to verbs.
Let's make this concrete. So instead of introducing myself at a barbecue by saying, I am a project manager, the noun, I need to identify the actions beneath the title.
Yes.
My identity becomes, I guide, I coordinate, I untangle complex problems, I empower teams.
Exactly. Think about the mechanical difference between those two self-definitions. Verbs are infinitely portable. A noun locks you in a room. A verb is a master key.
I love that.
If your identity is I, empower, and coordinate, you can apply those verbs anywhere. You can empower a team of 5 software engineers at a tech firm. You can coordinate a global supply chain for a manufacturer. You can empower a community organizing committee for a local political campaign.
The context changes, the industry changes, the salary changes, but you remain exactly the same.
When your identity is based on the actions you naturally biologically gravitate toward, you become infinitely adaptable to any economic landscape.
The sources talk about this in terms of discovering your work personality. It's about understanding the innate mechanics of how your brain actually prefers to engage with the world, devoid of any specific job title.
Right, the archetypes.
The research gives examples of different archetypes, like the pioneer or the auditor.
Yes, these archetypes are excellent ways to discover your verbs. Let's look at the auditor personality. If you are naturally an auditor type, your core verbs revolve around investigating, refining, organizing chaos, and applying deep, focused precision. If you tried to force an auditor to be a pioneer, someone whose verbs are ideating, boundary pushing, and constantly pitching new visions, the auditor will experience massive emotive dissonance. The emulator will crash.
They'll burn out.
These aren't just skills you learn in an MBA program, they are innate behavioral preferences. The goal of a transition is to align your professional path with your innate verbs. When you do that, the performative mask finally comes off, the friction stops, you stop acting, and you start simply being.
It makes me think of an analogy. Relying on a noun is like building a beautiful, expensive house on a very specific plot of rented land. The land is your job title.
Okay, I see where this is going.
You can decorate the house, you can be proud of it, but ultimately, the landlord can evict you. The market can change the zoning laws. The land can be sold out from under you, and your house is destroyed.
The noun is gone.
But shifting your identity to your innate verbs is like living in a highly capable, incredibly rugged, all-terrain vehicle. You aren't tied to the land. If the terrain changes from a paved highway to a muddy jungle, you don't panic. You just engage four-wheel drive.
You're self-contained.
You can drive that vehicle into any industry, any role, any freelance gig, and still know exactly who you are, how you operate, and what value you bring.
That is a beautiful, highly accurate way to visualize the shift. The all-terrain vehicle represents absolute psychological sovereignty.
Yeah.
And this brings us to the deepest layer of the research, the absolute bedrock of why all of this liminality, possible selves, verbs over nouns, matters so much to the human brain. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we aren't just talking about career strategies or how to update a resume. We are talking about the fundamental human need for narrative coherence.
Narrative coherence. We touched on this earlier when we talked about the jolts breaking our story. What does narrative coherence mean in the context of our entire lives?
We are, at our biological core, a storytelling species. We do not process reality through raw data. We process reality by constructing narratives.
We tell ourselves stories.
Identity itself, in psychological terms, can be defined as the internalized, evolving story that results from a person's selective appropriation of their past, their present, and their imagined future. When we go through a macro work role transition, we don't just endure the logistical changes of a new commute or a new boss.
We have to story the change.
We engage in a rigorous psychological process that researchers call narrative identity work.
Because if we can't explain the transition to ourselves in a way that makes logical sense, we feel fragmented. We feel like a collection of random events rather than a person. We feel like we've lost the plot of our own movie.
Precisely. Having a fragmented narrative repertoire, which means having multiple disconnected stories about who you are that don't hang together chronologically or logically, creates intense, almost unbearable emotional dissonance.
It's just confusing.
The human brain desperately needs our life story to have causality. Think about it like a mathematical equation. A leads to B, which inevitably leads to C. When you make a massive nonlinear leap, say, jumping from corporate law to documentary filmmaking, the equation breaks.
A no longer leads to B.
So you have to invent a transition narrative. You have to look back at your past, select specific memories, and connect the dots backward to convince yourself that this leap is actually authentic. And, equally importantly, you have to craft this story to convince others so they will socially validate your new identity.
We mentioned earlier that identity is socially constructed, reliant on an audience.
Yeah.
So when you're telling this transition story to your friends or to a hiring manager, you're essentially asking your audience, do you buy this? Do you see the logic? Do you accept me as this new thing?
Yes, and this raises an incredibly important point about the friction and pressure we face from society during a pivot. Society is lazy.
Yeah, it really is.
It forces us to use canonical cultural scripts to make our messy, complex lives legible to others. We rely on institutionalized storylines that everyone instantly recognizes, like the American dream, working hard to achieve wealth, or the rags to riches narrative.
And if we fit that script,
If your personal career transition story fits neatly into one of those recognizable archetypes, people nod, smile, accept it, and validate your new identity very quickly. It doesn't threaten them.
but if your story is, I was highly successful, I was making $500,000 a year, I had the corner office, but I felt completely hollow inside. So I quit to dabble in 3 different freelance projects that barely pay the bills because I am seeking alignment with my internal verbs.
Society looks at you like you are a deeply unstable person.
Because your story radically deviates from the script. It deviates from the social desirability of constant linear upward mobility. You're essentially telling them that the game they're playing might be rigged, which makes them defensive.
That makes total sense. That is why narrative identity work during a liminal transition is so incredibly exhausting. You are not just fighting your own internal doubts, you are fighting against massive cultural expectations to carve out a nuanced storyline that feels true to you.
But there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right?
Absolutely. The sociological research is completely clear on the endpoint. Successful completion of a transition, the moment you finally exit liminality, is marked by the emergence of a new, coherent narrative repertoire. You finally figure out how to tell the story of your past in a way that perfectly sets up your present and logically points toward your future.
Before we summarize, this brings up something we haven't explicitly touched on but feels completely urgent, especially right now. If we're supposed to shift from nouns to verbs to find fulfillment, what happens when artificial intelligence takes all the nouns?
Oh, that's a fascinating point.
Think about it. AI can already be a rudimentary litigator. It can be a coder, a copywriter, an analyst. If your entire identity and your entire economic value is tied to the noun, the specific output of the role, you are now competing directly with a machine that can do the noun perfectly, instantly, and without needing a salary.
Which is terrifying if you only have a noun.
But AI doesn't have verbs. It doesn't possess innate behavioral preferences. It doesn't authentically empower a team or catalyze human connection or innovate with weird, messy human intuition. It just executes. So maybe this psychological shift we've been talking about isn't just a luxury for finding personal happiness anymore. Maybe shifting your identity from a fragile noun to a resilient human verb is the only way to remain economically viable and emotionally sane in the next decade. Something for all of us to think about as the landscape shifts.
That's a really powerful thought.
If this conversation felt true for you, you're always welcome here. You can subscribe to Leone Patterns and continue with us.
We covered a lot today.
We did. We started this deep dive standing at a casual barbecue, paralyzed by a simple question. What do you do? We walk through the heavy, blistering reality of fusing our entire identity to a job title and the silent cognitive toll of emotive dissonance.
We explored the terror of stepping off the scripted path and into the unscripted wilderness of liminality.
We looked at the science of possible selves, realizing that we cannot think our way into a new life. We have to act our way into it through small work activities, the safety of weak ties, and the unavoidable ruptures of life jolts.
We challenged the toxic myth of the flawless hero's pivot, embracing instead the messy, iterative, necessary reality of the learning plot.
And finally, we realized that by shifting our anchor from fragile nouns to portable verbs, and by taking bold control of our narrative identity, we can build a professional self that is unbreakable, no matter how the world changes.
The confusion you feel right now, the friction, the sense of being untethered, it isn't a sign that you failed. It isn't a sign that you've lost the plot. It is the very proof that you are in the vital, deeply human, and necessarily messy process of writing a truer one.
Same pace, same questions. See you then.
Wow.